Hi, welcome back to another Anatomy of a Pose. Today we are going to be breaking down Vrksasana, or tree pose. And I want to start out by showing you one of my favorite resources. It's called Yoga Anatomy. I'm trying to show you without the glare from the light. But this is a great resource if you are curious at all about what muscles here are firing specifically. Oftentimes I give generalizations when we talk about how our muscles are working to move our bones, because that's the job of our muscles, they move our bones. But I don't get too wrapped up in this context around the names of certain muscles or the specific pieces, but I'm talking more about groups of muscles. If you're more curious though about that, this is a wonderful, wonderful resource. And I want to show you the picture from this book today that we're going to be talking about together. So if you look here at this picture, you can see here in tree pose that one leg here is standing, and this is your stabilizing leg. This is your point here of your stability. Now, the other leg here, you can notice here, is in a different shape. And we're going to talk more about what the actions are in order to make that shape. And so with this leg rotating out to the side, there's some complicated actions. And not only are we asking the outside of the hip here to shorten to externally, remember external rotation is turning out from your center, is those muscles are shortening to externally rotate your hip. But now you can see here these muscles, and we've been talking about them when we've been talking about our warrior shapes and how the adductors, so the intention of drawing our legs towards the center, that those muscles here now are getting lengthened. So this action here from your pubic bone to the inside of your knee, requiring the inside of your leg to lengthen as much as the outside of your hip here is externally rotating. Here's a little different look at it. So here is that piece here of the muscle or the muscular actions here that are externally rotating your hip. So they are shortening in order to rotate your hip to the outside. Now you can see here now another angle here from the back side of those stabilizing factors. The big one that we're going to talk about is what's going on here in the outside here of the hip, as well as the gluteus muscles and how they stabilize your pelvis. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the shape. So as we take a look at what's happening here in the legs, just like we were talking about our warrior poses, one leg is doing something different than the other, which means that we've got one side, in this case, is going to be doing more of a stabilizing action, while the other side here, our other leg, is going to be taking an action of external rotation. Remember, external rotation is turning out away from your center. Internal rotation is turning in towards your center. And then we're also going to be talking about the action here on the inside of the leg because of the amount of length that it requires here to adduct our leg. So abduction is reaching our leg away, and adduction, ADD, abduction's ABD. I know when it comes through audio, sometimes I think it sounds the same. But then we bring our leg in, this is this muscle group here that shortens to bring us into the middle. But in this case, our leg is externally rotated, and now we're asking this to have length. So before we even break down here into some of the specifics of what's going on in that leg, let's talk about our gluteus muscles. So our glute maximus, you've got three sections or three different muscles here that make your gluteus muscles. Your glute maximus, which is going to be the larger muscle group that sits on the back of your leg. Your glute medius. Now this is a really, really important one that we're going to spend most of the time talking about today. It inserts here at the edge of your pelvis and comes down into the outside of your thigh bone. What that's going to do then is not only stabilize your leg, so if you took your hand and brought it to the outside of your hip, so not behind you, but just to the outside, put your fingers there, put your hand there, and just shift the weight into that leg. Do you notice how it becomes tense or tight? That's because it's stabilizing your hip. Now that same muscle, if you looked back at that picture I was just showing you, is also also one of the bigger muscle groups anyway, and there's some other muscles in there as well that are going to externally rotate your hip, and they work together to take your femur bone and rotate it away from your center. When you do that, if you took your hand back to the outside of your hip, that muscle group, if you imagine from your outside of your hip, so imagine that, or find that space here on the outside of your femur bone, okay? As your greater trochanter, and the muscles then that wrap to the back side of your pelvis, they shorten when you externally rotate your hip. So if you take your toes out to the side, feel how that turns on. Feel how it shortens here as you rotate your hip outward. Okay, so it's got two different jobs here. And where this gets tricky is that on your standing leg, it's stabilizing. On your rotated leg, or your leg that's turned out and bent, it's an external rotator. So it gets really interesting. So you can imagine then that oftentimes what happens, if I don't have a lot of stabilization, or if I've struggled with muscle weakness or other hip-related problems, that what can happen is that when we go to shift the weight into one leg, the pelvis loses its symmetry, which means that when I shift the weight into one leg, if I just start here, if I hike a hip, I'm cheating. It takes my pelvis shifts, which means now my spine has done some lateral flexion. But in standing balance poses like this, our spine is neutral, which means we need to focus a little bit more on the stability of our pelvis, which means we have to focus on the muscles that stabilize our pelvis, your glute muscles. In this case, they're your primary ones anyway. So if we start here in this a little bit wider stance, and my feet are here right underneath my hips, and I take my hands to my hips. Now, obviously, there's a shift, right? I put more weight into one side that I'm going to balance on. But if I have my hands here at my hip, and I stabilize, and I turn on the outside of my hip, now, when I go to lift my opposite leg, and I keep stabilizing that hip, what's going to happen is it's going to then work in conjunction with the other side so that I don't drop it or hike it. So if I hike my hip, now I've recruited here some of my muscles more in my core, shorten my spine, but we want the spine to remain neutral. We want the pelvis to remain neutral so that we've got stability here in our center. And that's what's going to be really important, especially if you struggle with balance. Okay? So as much as this is stabilizing here on the outside of the hip, it's also stabilizing both sides of our pelvis so that this doesn't happen where we hike a hip, or more commonly what happens is this, is popping a hip out to the side, and here, this is kind of like sassy hip tree pose. But instead, draw in the outside of the hip, reach down through your heel, and now I've got this strong, powerful shape in my standing leg. Now, because my muscles around my pelvis are stabilizing my pelvis, what's happening here in the rest of the leg? Now, one of my favorite things to think about is that if my foot on my standing leg is my base of stability, that's the point of contact I have here on the ground. If I spread out through my feet, and this is where how our feet and our ankles and how that goes up the chain of our leg, how it relates to my knee and how it relates to my hip, that if I spread out through that foot, imagine here where I can engage the muscles of my foot. Engage the muscles here, not only just on the front of my leg, but on the back of my leg, so that they're co-contracting. So as much as one side is firing, the other side is firing in order to maintain that sense of balance. Why? Because I've got stability here at the two ends, through my foot and at my hip. Now, if I have had issues with my feet and the stability of my feet or my ankles, you can imagine that if I collapse in, I'll give you an example of that. If I collapse in, can you see how my knee turns in? Okay. So if I collapse at my arches, my knees come in, and then you can see how my femur bones come in towards the center. So what happens here, if I find my entire foot If we think back to some of those beginning classes that we were talking about, how we use our foot here to balance, to stand, and now we're talking about balance. Imagine again that the foot has that triangle, or those triangle points, okay? So you've got the big toe side of your foot, the pinky toe side of your foot, and your heel. So if you make those connections, like connect the dots, spread out through your feet. You could even lift your toes and then set them down again. So now I'm engaged through my foot, I'm engaged through the arch of my foot, just like I'm doing in Tadasana. And then I shift the weight over, but again, not by hiking my pelvis, but by stabilizing my pelvis on my standing leg. You can feel here, if you took your hands to the outside, again, you can feel how they're working, how they're stabilizing. So if I don't have stability in my standing leg, and I don't have stability in my pelvis, then what happens to my sense of balance, right? It gets really wobbly and wiggly. Or if I collapse into the inside of my foot, it takes my knee and my hip out of alignment, and then we dump energy out, and then we don't have that beautiful, strong foundation that we're stacking upon in order to maintain vertical. So, with all of that in mind, let's shift the idea to what's happening here in the other leg. So spreading out through my foot, engaging through my foot, feeling that lift, draw up through my arch. I have those 3 points sealed in my sense of where my body is, my big toe of my foot, pinky toe side of my foot, and the heel. So with a little softness in my leg, and what that's going to allow me to do is engage through the muscles here in the front and the back side of my legs. They're co-contracting here to stabilize. Stabilizing here on the outside of my pelvis. Watching that when I start to take a different action to the opposite leg, that I don't lose it. I don't get into sassy hip mode. So we zip it on in. If you're ever curious about building strength, specifically into that area of the body, reach out, let me know. There's lots of tricks that we can do. So now let's talk about the opposite leg. So if we start by thinking about that my toes would stay on the ground. I've got my pelvis here, stable, strong in my standing leg. Now, the outside of my hip, thinking from your outside of your thigh bone here, there's that bone that sticks out right here. Okay? It's the top of your femur bone. And the muscle that goes back towards the backside of my pelvis, that's going to shorten. So if I shorten that and externally rotate my hip, I'm taking it away from the center here. Now, if I even start here with my heel at the inside of my foot, hands are still at my hips, maybe, so just give myself a little point here if my pelvis is stable. Now, the inside of your standing leg is going to activate some because those are your adductors. We're drawing towards the middle, we're drawing towards the center. So if I consider that I can keep the other hip in external rotation, wrapping around to the outside, now, if this foot comes up to my calf muscle, if I press that foot into my standing leg, you're going to feel, again, more intention and action in what's happening in your pelvis. But there's also a lengthening that's happening from your pubic bones, your adductor muscles, to the inside of your knee on the leg that's bent. So if I get here, and I already notice that I've lost some of the stability in my hip, and my pelvis is now tipped to the side, and I've lost the stability here, then this is where staying with the kickstand is a beautiful place to stay. You'll notice though that in the kickstand there's not as much adduction work as there is as your foot draws up towards your calf muscle. So as much as your foot is reaching into your leg, your standing leg is reaching back. And again, you're going to feel the inside of your legs fire there in adduction. Now what we have to watch out for adduction is, does that tip my pelvis in? Remember, we're keeping and thinking about the stability here in my pelvis so it stabilizes my spine. Now, if I'm there and that feels okay, what happens when I flex at the hip? You can always bring a hand down and help. Because we never want to press into the inside of the knee. So if I'm here, again, I'm going to add that quality of pressing my foot into my standing leg. And so now, again, I'm going to feel the adductors on the inside of my standing leg while still engaged on the outside. Pelvis is stable. Lengthening here on the front side of my leg, but shortening at the outside of my hip to draw me in external rotation. Now what you have to watch out for is if I externally rotate on this side, and if this hip doesn't feel like it has a lot of stability, sometimes what happens is that we pivot. If my pelvis then spins, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add torque to my knee. We never want that, right? So sometimes thinking about working into external rotation, but not going to the point where if you take your leg into external rotation, you're shortening the outside of your hip, and then your opposite hip follows, then back off of it a little bit. And then you're gonna just work with building the ability and the capacity in external rotation on the leg that's bent. And you might have noticed too in that time, do you notice how my foot is working? There's the shift, right? We're not statues, we're dynamic creatures. So there's going to be a lot of aliveness moving to the inside or the outside to find that center and balance point. So focusing here again, always on the parts first that stabilize us, because any other way that we dress this up is now going to be adding challenge to our ability to balance. So again, building this from the ground up, again, staying here, noticing already in external rotation what happens in the opposite hip. Does it pop to the side? Does my hip drop? Can I stay strong? Do I twist some in order to think I'm externally rotating more than I actually am? So again, feeling how my hips can stay square and taking that journey. Now, if I'm here or here, right? Doesn't matter. It's where you feel stable and where your pelvis can remain in the place in which we're intending it to be. Then your hands can be at your heart. If you have freedom of breath there, wonderful. And if you want to explore more, your arms could reach up. They can be up to the side. They can be where you want them to be. And then what I want you to notice is that if you reach your arms over your head, notice with overarm movement, remember what we talked about before with our shoulder blades gliding up our back in order to elevate our arms, that if elevating your arms challenges the breath in your thoracic spine to where now it doesn't feel like I have as much access to breath, you might bring your hands back down. Now, if I elevate my arms up, and that allows me to feel expanse, if I want to play with balance and challenge, again, this is an extension of challenging your balance, your sense of balance. It's secondary to what's going on from your hips down. So play around with it. Reach out to me if you have any questions at all. I'm more than happy to help. Be well, stay well, and we'll see you.